Eli, for those opening statements. All right, now we're transitioning to the core of the debate, the crossfire, the most exciting part of a debate. So once again, the affirmative goes first. So we're going to allow Eli to question Chris for his first 10-minute cross-examination.
All right. You said a lot of good things, and what I first want to get out of the way is I appreciate it, because most atheists or skeptics or whatever don't usually come out and share their views as clearly as you did. So I appreciate that. So you said that God creates evil. What is your view? What do you think Christians believe about the ontological nature of evil?
The ontological nature of evil? That which would be the opposite of good.
Okay. Do you think, on the Christian view, evil has an ontological essence?
In the Christian worldview, I'd say that good and evil both have ontological essence. My personal thought, though, this is just me speaking from my worldview. Obviously, we're going to have to be doing a lot of that. My personal thought is that good and evil are labels that we assign onto actions. And what we assign onto those actions a lot of times can be a matter of perspective. So if I see, for instance, if I see something like, say, a family member of mine is killed, I see that as evil. However, from somebody else's perspective, that might not be seen as evil. But that's never going to change the fact that, to me, this is going to be considered an evil action.
Right. And so, well, I'm trying to ask these questions because I'm trying to understand how you perceive what Christians believe about the ontological essence of evil. In other words, to say that God creates evil, we do not believe that he actually creates this thing called evil. And evil is a privation. And so there's not something that God creates and it's called evil. Evil is something that is not in conformity with his nature. So, and violates his law or whatever. So it's more of action that is in disconformity to the standard, which is God. So it's not something that he actually creates out of his nature. So I would say that your statement in regards to God creates anything that's consistent with his nature, God creates evil, therefore God is evil, or something to that effect. I would say that it doesn't follow, since the Christian position, we do not hold that there's this positive ontological essence of evil that God creates. That's why I was asking the question. So you gave me a view of what you think evil is, but that's not what the Christian position holds to. So do you want to clarify a little bit of what you think the Christian position is, and maybe perhaps retract that as an argument, or you can clarify and rephrase the argument?
Sure. So if I could, I know this is your time to question me, but there is one of these things that I would have to say necessarily leads into it. Do you believe that God creates color?
I'm sorry?
Do you believe that God creates color?
Well, again, I don't want to overstep the bounds. You could ask me when it's your turn. So I don't want to, because once we let the question go back and forth, then we'll kind of intermix and we'll defeat the whole purpose of cross-examination. So you could ask me that question, and I'll try my best to answer that. All right. So
then I will have to say that I'll have to side. At that point, I'd have to actually sidestep your question, because my answer will necessitate your answer on that. So we'd have to move on to another question at that point.
Okay. All right. So in regards to epistemology, you said you are a pragmatist, right?
Yes.
Do you believe in objective truth?
I believe that the concept of objective truth can be useful.
Do you believe that there is something? Do you believe that there is objective truth?
I have a definition of truth, if that will work for you.
Do you understand what I mean when I say objective truth?
Perhaps you could clarify.
Okay. I think objective truth deals with something that is true, independent of our personal opinions. So something is true, independent of what we think about. And there's something out there that's objectively truth. Do you believe that there is objective truth? And do you believe that it's possible for someone to know that objective truth?
So for somebody to know an objective truth, that actually would fit into my personal definition of truth. My definition of truth in general is, if something, well, hold on. Best to say, my definition of truth is that which comports to reality. My definition of knowledge is a belief that comports with reality. If you believe, so if we have a Venn diagram, truth is on one side, belief is on another. Where truth and belief collide is where knowledge is, at least in my personal worldview. If you believe something and it happens to be true, then you have knowledge.
Is there any way that someone could have access to what is actually the case, so that they believe things that are true and that they can know them to be objectively true within your worldview perspective?
Within my worldview perspective, Strangely enough, so within pragmatism, something being objectively true, as in something having ontological value, correct? Is that how you would define this?
I would say that something to be objectively true, we are believing something. We have, again, I would define truth as a justified, or knowledge as a justified true belief. Can we have beliefs that are true, and we have justification for believing they're true, and those reflect the objective reality?
So, justified true belief, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm
Mhm.
wrong, but justified true belief basically takes the Venn diagram that I have, where
Okay.
believed things and true things are on one side, knowledge is in the middle, and it adds a third piece to the Venn diagram where there's a justified side. So anything that is justified and believed and true becomes knowledge.
So can we have access to objective reality such that we know it, on your perspective of pragmatism, an epistemological view of pragmatism?
I would agree that we don't actually have access to objective reality. Everything that we see, everything that we perceive is filtered.
Okay, so if that's the case, then would you say that your worldview system lacks the preconditions for intelligibility, since every worldview would have to have some forms of truth or something to undergird a foundation for knowledge?
So intelligibility just has to do with whether or not it is intelligible. I know that's a bit of a tautology. Basically, if something can be, it's basically if something can be understood or is accessible or digestible. Under pragmatism, yes, because literally, if something is unintelligible or undigestible, then it's going to be discarded. That's what happens in pragmatism. If something cannot be understood in its form, then it must be set up in a way and so that it can be understood while also still being true. So for instance, if I were explaining a mathematical concept to somebody and my method was unintelligible, then my method would need to be discarded and I would need to find a new method in order to teach the person.
Okay, but when I say intelligibility, what is the preconditions for intelligibility? Well, logic has to be binding. We need to have correct reasoning processes within an epistemological perspective that is pragmatic, and that you don't, as you've admitted, you don't have access to objective truth. How can you hold those consistently within your worldview? That we need logic, these unchanging universal standards, unless you want to define how you understand logic. How do you have those things which we must know objectively, but within a worldview in which we have no access to objective reality? It seems as though, on the one hand, you would say we have no access to it, but then to even have intelligibility, you have to presuppose it, since you have to presuppose the validity of logical laws and their unchangeable nature.
You've just made two separate statements, and I want to point this out to you because I don't think you're a bad faith actor, so I'm 90% certain you didn't catch that you said this.
Okay.
But you said one has to presuppose that we can ascertain, essentially, the ontological truth of something, if we can ascertain if something is ontologically true. And then you said, but on the other hand, you argue whether or not something is in fact ontologically true. Here we have a warring of issues. On the one hand, you're asking about personal perception. And on the other hand, you're asking about ontology. Personal perception is going to be a perception of ontology and a filtering of what is objectively true. As an example, I asked the question earlier, but I will say it in a statement form instead because it is required for this. If you're familiar with the concept of is your green my green, this is a very common concept for things like color theory. Is your green my green basically says, if I'm looking at an item and I perceive that it is a shade of green, is that item in fact green? Is the ontological nature of this item's color green? Well, there's a lot of things that go into that. For one, my perception of it is that this object is green. If we just look at the perception of the shade, someone else's perception of that is going to be that it is a completely different shade of green. We can get 10 people to disagree on what shade of green a particular leaf is. However, if we actually look at what goes into making a green leaf green, we find that the only color that is absent in that leaf is green, because the leaf itself is absorbing every color except the green. It's reflecting the green, and that's why we see that. So is this leaf actually green? Well, again, we come to, well, no, ontologically it's not green. So does it have color? Well, yes, it contains all colors. Well, no, it's actually containing wavelengths. This is the problem with ontology versus perception. My perception of this is being filtered through several different several different chasms in order to get to the point where I perceive this leaf as green. But ontologically, that statement doesn't even make sense.
All right,
Right.
that's
So
time.
let me interject there. So are
That's
you
time right
saying
there.
that we cannot know objective reality? We only know perception?
All right,
I would
Eli,
say we can only know perception.
That's time, fellas. That's time.
Okay.
All
right,
right.
thank you.
All right, Chris, it is your turn to cross-examine Eli for 10 minutes.
Sure thing. And I'm sorry if I ate up the last couple minutes there, Eli.
That's okay. That's okay.
It was not my intent. That's why I was trying to ask that as a question beforehand. I'm also eating into my time now here, unfortunately.
Okay.
Okay. So one of the things that you pointed out is that we're having a conversation on worldviews, therefore we can't have a tit-for-tat discussion. But if we can't have a tit-for-tat discussion, then what is the point of us even having a conversation at this point? And I'm not trying to be rude there, but
no, it's not just a tit-for-tat discussion. What I said was a tit-for-tat discussion over specific things. In other words, what I'm focusing on is that the difference between you and I is not an issue of just merely I have a fact that you don't, or we're arguing for specific things. I just wanted to bring the point that when we're discussing these issues, it's system versus system, not independent neutral facts. That's what I meant by that.
Okay, that's fair. And then another point you brought up stemming from that, the debate isn't about facts, it's about worldview systems. If your opponent desires to discuss a particular point, that point can only work in reference to a worldview. So for instance, if I were to ask you the nature of truth, you would embed that in God, correct?
I would say that God is the source of all truth because creation reflects, what his plan, his purpose, everything that is made is understood within that context. So things are true because God makes them true.
Okay. So my question then becomes, one of the criticisms that you gave for and it's one of the things that you noted that I didn't do, so I do thank you for noting that, is that there's a slippery nature where a lot of skeptics are concerned, where they take the lack of belief position and then just say, I'm not convinced, I'm not convinced, I'm not convinced, and they won't actually give you, this is my worldview, this is how I came to it, these are my positive assertions against a particular type of God. They just hide behind, I'm not convinced. Do you see there as being any functional difference between that slippery nature and the nature of being able to hide behind, well, nothing's true without God, so therefore everything doesn't work without God?
I think it's irrelevant. I'm not, the nature of my argumentation is not that I'm hiding behind God. I actually think that the worldview of the Christian worldview actually is the preconditions. I'm not just saying God, just answers the question, but it just so happens that from my perspective, I think God does answer questions much better than the non-God position. So it's not an issue of hiding behind it. I'm willing to tell you what my entire worldview is. You are willing to tell me what your worldview is. Many people don't because they don't want to defend a specific point, in some cases. So I don't think it's relevant.
Yeah, I don't have such a problem with that.
Good. Well, good. Yeah. And I appreciate that. I really do. So I have no problem letting people know what I believe, and then they could ask the questions and we can engage in internal worldview critique. So I'm not hiding behind something. And I do understand, as you probably would agree, there are some people who do hide their position so that they don't have to defend what they defend. It just so happens in this discussion, we're not doing that.
Fair enough. And I do appreciate the honesty there. If there's one thing that I don't like, it is a slippery interlocutor, as it were. Not because it gets very hard to pin them down on things, but because it's very difficult to actually have a discussion at that point. Okay. So the next question I had is, you said that no fact is neutral. Under my worldview, facts are definitionally neutral. It is how you use those facts. I guess this is because it's from a pragmatics perspective. So for me, it's the usage of the facts that cause the facts to be either for or against any particular position. But I view facts personally as neutral. Could you clarify the statement, facts are not neutral?
In other words, me and you will understand the foundation of any fact in completely different ways, given the diametrical opposites of our worldview. Since God created everything on my worldview, every fact is what it is because God created that fact to be what it is. And so you don't hold to that. And so for me, there is no such thing as casting my worldview aside and then you casting your worldview aside and then just making sense out of this independent worldview, independent piece of data. So I would deny the existence of brute facts. I don't think brute facts speak for themselves. I think facts only make sense within a worldview context. And so in that sense,
So-
I would say they're not neutral. We can't interpret a fact independent of an intellectual framework with which we use to interpret the fact.
Okay, so you don't view brute facts as a thing that exist in an abstract sense, mind you, not exist as in this has ontological value.
Uninterpreted facts.
Uninterpreted facts. Okay.
Right.
So do you accept? I'm fairly certain you do, but do you accept axioms then?
Some axioms, yeah. Axioms are. It depends, because when you get into, I'm a presuppositionalist. When you get into presuppositionalism as an apologetic methodology, you have two branches between Cornelius Van Til and Gordon Clark. And I think a key distinction here is that Clark held that the Bible is the word of God is his axiom. And he would define axiom as something that cannot be justified by appealing to something external to itself. Anyone could pick any axiom, and so there's no justification for it. He just thought that if you pick an axiom, it needs to be able to coherently build your worldview. Whereas on my perspective, I don't take axioms in that fashion. As a matter of fact, I rarely use the term axiom. I would use, and I kind of just use this myself, I don't know if there's actual technical terminology for this. I would say that I have an ultimate presupposition. Now, I think the faulty thing about how people understand presuppositions, can you still hear me?
I can still hear you just fine.
Okay, because I lost these AirPods. See, this ran out of battery, so I'm going to recharge this and switch between them.
Just so you know, these guys are only $20.
Okay, so thank
so
you very much.
if you wanted to get a replacement that doesn't have a battery.
Okay, sounds good. So I would take my foundation not as an axiom, but as an ultimate presupposition. And I think there's a fault in people's understanding of a presupposition, and that there's a common understanding that presuppositions are assumptions without justification. And I deny that. If someone were to say that a presupposition is an elementary assumption without justification, what they're doing is actually implicitly rejecting the reality of transcendental argumentation. Since transcendental argumentations try to justify presuppositions, not by appealing to something external to itself, but by appealing to its transcendental necessity. Kind of like that example when I used logic. Deny it, and you demonstrate it, because logic must be something that's actual in order to deny.
It's a lot like when somebody says they think philosophy. Cool, excellent. Okay, so my contention with that, from what's the best way to word this? From everything that I've studied in philosophy, there is no functional difference to me between a presupposition and an axiom. And an unquestionable presupposition, from what I understand, is simply an axiom, because an axiom, all an axiom is a truism. It is a principle or a dictum, something that is regarded as being established, accepted, or self-evidently true. So if you presuppose God, you are saying that God is self-evidently true. He is justified in and of himself by simply being himself, correct?
Well, I would disagree with your understanding of the presupposition as seeing no functional difference between an ultimate presupposition and axiom. To say that there's just functionally no difference is to implicitly deny the validity of transcendental arguments, because the very fact that an ultimate presupposition, my ultimate presupposition, and not just this presupposition of God, but say, for example, the assumption of logic, it is an ultimate starting point, but it is justified. It's just not justified in the same way some other presuppositions may be. So when if you try to justify a presupposition, but an ultimate presupposition, by a standard outside of itself, then that presupposition is no longer your ultimate standard. The ultimate standard is the thing by which you judge the validity of that prior presupposition.
You just cut out. I can't hear you anymore.
It is justified by an appeal to its own transcendental necessity. That's the difference. Now, I'm not sure how much you've studied in this area.
I would have one question. One question for Eli.
Okay.
It's regarding to the debate and not regarding to the debate at the same time. Can you send me, after this debate, any reading that you have done on the nature of axioms versus presuppositions, so that I can read those? Because you're the first person that has tried to argue that axioms and presuppositions have any functional difference that I've seen.
Wow. Okay. I mean, have you ever studied the works of someone like Cornelius Van Til and Greg Bahnsen?
I have not, though I have several Calvinist friends who have, and I've had I'm not sure if you're familiar with RCA, for instance, Reformed Christian Apologist.
Okay.
He's an apologetic YouTuber as well. You guys actually, you guys are both Calvinists. You might get along.
A of my study here is through audio and things like that, and I wouldn't know which page, but I could give you resources where you can kind of see a presentation of a transcendental argument, so you can kind of see
if you
what
want to
they're
send
doing.
that to me, I'll gladly digest it.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So, do you want to continue that 30 seconds, Chris, or do you want to conclude?
No,
that
was my 30 seconds.
Okay, that was your 30
research
seconds.
material for post debate.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Okay, Eli, you got the second go for 10 minutes.
Okay, so so it seems to be that you hold to an epistemological perspective that seems to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, have the same logical outcome of something along the lines of Immanuel Kant, so that we can't know the noumena, we can only know perception. Is that your view?
That would be my view. I don't think that we can understand what is ontologically true through our perception, but we can get close enough to be able to function, and that's really all that we need to be able to do. In my perspective.
Okay, all right. So if we can't know perception, we can't know reality, and so do you see why I would think that as an epistemology, you don't have the preconditions for intelligibility? Kant's perspective, I would argue, is fallacious. You know, it's kind of like he commits what some have called the nothing but fallacy, right? It's a fallacy because nothing but statements imply more than knowledge. Kant says he knows the data that gets to his brain is nothing but phenomena, but in order to know this, he would have to be able to see more than just the phenomena. In other words, in order to differentiate one thing from another thing, you have to be able to perceive where one ends and the other begins. So when he says we can't know anything about reality, he's actually making a statement about reality that, given his own principles, he couldn't know. And so do you see the issue where you're saying we can't know reality, but you're in an objective sense, but you're actually making a claim that, well, we can only know perception?
I think it's fairly demonstrable that we can only know perception. For instance, we have a perception of free will, which I know that as a Calvinist you probably already have contentions with just on a basis of me uttering that. But for instance, we have a perception of free will. However, from what we've understood from brain scans, most of our decision making is done about 6 microseconds in the subconscious before we actually have a chance to make it in the conscious.
That the case? Is that the case, or is that the way we perceive it? Again, when you say those things about studies, it presupposes that we have knowledge that those studies reflect something that is true. So again, if we apply,
here's the nature of pragmatism and how it helps here. So with pragmatism, under pragmatism, what we find, if what we find has usage, if what we find has utility, then that is as far as it goes. That is as far as it need go. What we understand about the human brain is that things happen in the subconscious before they happen in the conscious, before you are perceptually aware, before you have perception of a decision that has been made. It has been made. Now, granted, for legal purposes, we still have to hold people culpable for their actions, regardless of any legal apologetic saying that, oh, well, the subconscious was in charge of that, not the conscious. But there are, as an example, for pragmatism, when we were looking at something like science, I said in my opening statement that pragmatism views science as a tool. It sees it through the lens of instrumentalism. As long as it is yielding results and it's yielding consistent results, then it maintains utility, and then we continue using it, regardless of whether or not it can say anything about ontology in its purest form, which it one day might be able to. I don't know. I don't have that ability to
but if I can cut in, it still seems to me that on the pragmatic view, it's making knowledge claims that goes beyond what pragmatism allows for. I mean, on the one hand, you claim that we can't know anything about the real world because we use these things pragmatically. Well, on the other hand, asserting that we can know the real world is unknowable in that way, or make any statement, well, perhaps we can know in the future. You're still making knowledge claims that even themselves are not objectively true necessarily. Because
are they knowledge claims or are they belief claims?
Well, if you believe them, then why should anyone believe them to be true? On that worldview, you don't have preconditions for knowledge, because it seems as that on your worldview you can't have knowledge. You're not concerned with true beliefs. You're concerned with what works. But then we could ask the question: is it objectively true that pragmatism seeks after what works? You still are stuck in a need for objective truth, which your view seems to not allow.
So there's 2 types of objective truth we're dealing with here. You're talking about objective truth about an abstract principle. So what pragmatism as an epistemology is concerned with is an abstract principle, because I cannot hold pragmatism in my hand in the same way that I cannot hold one in my hand, or I cannot hold purple in my hand. I can hold facsimiles of these concepts, but I cannot hold the actual thing in my hand. The ontologically true or false nature of a proposition is not the same thing as the ontologically true nature of, say, the exact chemical makeup of my desk, for instance. That's something that even if I were to be able to break down to the quark, there's still things below that I don't know. There's still parts about reality of this desk that I do not know. Whereas the truth value of a proposition is in a different category.
Is it objectively true that it's in a different category?
Again, we have to go to the fact that we're dealing with propositions. Propositions are not the same thing as the ontological nature of reality. These are things that we have built up in ourselves, in our own conversations. For instance, is it ontologically true that Superman can fly, as an example? Well, no, but within the reality that's been built around the character of Superman, yes. So is it ontologically true that pragmatism says A or B? Well, no, there's no ontological value to it. But within the framework of pragmatism, then we can make that statement.
Is it objectively true that within the framework of pragmatism we can make those statements?
You can dial this back 1,000 times. The answer is going to be the
that's
same.
right, and I would, but it's the point
because
is,
the game.
Because
well, don't apologize, because I understand what the game here is, and I'm not saying that you're gaming me.
Don't worry about it. You don't have to just. I understand. You're a nice enough guy. I understand. We're just having a conversation.
But this is basically a hyper application of the Socratic method.
I'm really not thinking along those terms. I'm just thinking of trying to consistently apply a pragmatic outlook. On the one hand, we can't know objective reality, yet you're making statements when you make reference to scientific studies or anything like that. It seems to me that that's inconsistent with a pragmatic approach. If we can't know objective reality, then you can't really make any statements that reflect reality unless you're just saying they're just useful, which you go into infinite regress. That's why I keep asking.
When you go into this infinite regress, when you start getting to the point of infinite regress, that's usually where pragmatism will stop, because an infinite regress does not have utility. It does not have explanatory power. It lacks utility. For instance, when we are talking about, I understand you think you've got me in a gotcha. I see that look on your face.
I just wanted to ask a question there. When you said that an infinite regress has no utility, well, it does have utility if, by pointing that you're stuck in an infinite regress, it shows the futility of that view as being a sufficient epistemological perspective that can ground knowledge and everything else within one's worldview. That's the utility of going through the infinite regress, not like what some presuppositionalists say. Well, how do you know that's true? How do you know that's? I'm not trying to do that as kind of a got you. I'm trying to consistently apply on that perspective. That is a problem. The infinite regress is a problem within pragmatism, which, as I perceive it, makes it an insufficient epistemological position to hold as a grounding for knowledge. So if, on your view, we can't have knowledge, and you can correct me if you do believe in some way we can, then my original argument is true, that the non-Christian position, your specific version of it, does not have the preconditions for knowledge, given the truth of your own perspective.
Under pragmatism, it would also be argued that nobody has the preconditions for knowledge. It's not just that the pragmatist does not have this ability. It's that everybody lacks the ability to do this. For instance, one of the things that was brought up was, as long as something has utility, we keep it. And there seems to be issues with that. But as an example, you are speaking to me through a microphone that is currently connected to an iPad that is currently being ran by a logical processor, and that logical processor is a direct result of pragmatic thinking, regardless of the ontological value of anything in that. No, actually, historically, that's true. Check it out.
Well, I want to go back to
processors were actually originally invented by pragmatists. I'm not kidding you.
That's fine. What I'm getting at is when you say that we can't, you're saying that in the pragmatic approach, everyone's in this position. Again, given pragmatism, you're not in a place to know that this is everyone's situation. Again, you're making statements that go beyond what pragmatism allows. If you're a pragmatist and we can't have objective reality,
pragmatism
how
isn't
can you make
pragmatism isn't epistemology,
it's still my time, so I just want to ask this question. On a pragmatic epistemology, how can you make the sweeping statement that everyone is in the same position? That just begs the question in favor of your position. We can't know reality, so how can you know what other people are able to do in regards to epistemological issues? That's my question.
So the answer to that would be, as far as pragmatism is concerned, it is useful to be able to make the statement that it seems to be the case that everybody's stuck in the same boat, but it is also equally useless to operate under the condition that nobody can perceive reality. And again, you're dealing with an epistemology, which is about personal theories of truth, personal theories and beliefs, and trying to juxtapose that to ontology, which is about the case of things ontologically in the world.
I would say that everything that we do, our worldview necessarily.
Eli, that's time right there. That's time right there. That's time right there.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, so Chris. Now, go ahead, Chris.
There's not that much time to answer and go back and forth. So thank you.
Right,
yeah,
no
10 minutes is small, but that's fine.
All right, Chris, you have 10 minutes to go for it.
Sure thing. I'm actually going back on my notes here. So when you say that an argument is transcendental, transcendental arguments argue what must be the case in order for something else to be the case. Is that not a type of misapplication of the principle of entailment, where if you say one thing must be the case for another thing to be the case, do you have a way of actually demonstrating that is, again, the case at that point?
Yeah, when I deal with issues of transcendental argumentation, it asks what are the preconditions. In other words, there are things that must be true in order for us to have this conversation. For example, logic must be applicable, universal principles, in order for us to even have a coherent conversation. Now, if one wants to, someone says, well, I don't believe in logic, demonstrate it for me. The very denial of logic.
That person's going to make me angry.
Well, yes, that's true. And you'd be surprised. I've actually heard people who actually do deny logic. But the point still goes that to deny logic, you've actually demonstrated it. Why? Because transcendental arguments are proven by the impossibility of the contrary. Deny them, and the person's position is reduced to absurdity, just like the person who would deny the existence of logic. So when we're talking about transcendentals, they are proven by the impossibility of the contrary. Deny them, and you've demonstrated them. Affirm them, and you're still, the point is made either way. That's why they're so important, because,
Does that not sound somewhat circular to you, though? That literally makes it to where you have a position that has no ability to even be falsifiable.
Well,
because the contrary is impossible.
Right. So when we say something is necessarily true, then it's non-falsifiable. So I would say logic is necessarily true, and by definition is unfalsifiable. Try to falsify it, and you demonstrate its truth because you need to presuppose it in order to do that.
You need to utilize logic in order to undermine logic.
That logic is invalid. You're going to have to give me an argument which presupposes logic, and then you'd be demonstrating the very point I'm making.
Okay. So when we're dealing with the transcendental arguments, the issue that this is not an issue that they present, but in the questioning, you end up reducing the opponent's argument to an infinite regress or an ad infinitum. And then I would assume in your worldview, God is used as the terminator for that regress, correct?
That is correct, yes.
The ability of God to terminate the infinite regress comes from omnipotence.
Right. I would say that
just from his existence.
God is the stopping point. If you don't have a stopping point, then you run into the risk of an infinite regress, and you'll never be able to justify anything that's built upon that, because you can't build something upon something without a foundation.
Okay. So then my question is, if you're going to use God as a foundation there, and we're going to argue that you would argue that he is self-evident, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So on the proposition that God is sufficiently self-evident, do you not see how that causes a bit of a uniqueness problem?
What do you mean by uniqueness problem?
So the uniqueness problem comes down to he is unique in and of himself. We have no way of understanding without extra means that he exists because of his uniqueness. For instance, I have no way of knowing that a tree, like if there's only one tree in existence, as an example, I have no way of knowing that that tree exists unless I see that one tree. Otherwise, I have to have a reference point to find that one tree. This is the uniqueness principle. If only one of this thing exists and there's no way for us to compare it to any other thing that is like it because there's nothing like it, then we have to have some way of determining that it's there. So if God is self-evident, how do we actually establish that he's self-evident? It seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that we would need scripture in order to show that he is self-evident. But if we require scripture to understand that God is self-evident, then doesn't that now mean that he is no longer self-evident because we have required scripture in order to even get to a belief claim on God, who is supposedly self-evident?
Right. That presupposes that knowledge of God is mediate, that we need to look and conclude, oh, look, there's God. If we grant the Christian perspective, the knowledge of God is both mediate and immediate. We can know God by, if you're familiar with the verse, the heavens declares the glory of God, but also knowledge of God is immediate in that man is creating the image of God. And so that very image, the very thinking process, makes man, in a sense, aware of God. Now, we get into some theological issues of, and again, this part gets, most skeptics find this insulting, but the Christian position, as I said at the beginning, teaches that in some way, if we can kind of work our way and discuss this issue of self-deception, in some way, all men know that God exists. Again, you don't have to agree with that, but that's the Christian position. And that knowledge of God is actually innate. Scripture is more specific knowledge. And so we would make a distinction there between general revelation and special revelation. But general revelation includes not only knowledge of God mediated through our observing, but it's also knowledge of God immediately, in that the very fact that we're creating his image, it's kind of like what John Calvin says, that we cannot understand, when we understand ourselves, knowledge of God and knowledge of man is simultaneous. We can't know ourselves unless we, in some sense, know God. So it's an immediate knowledge of God, not necessarily something that we draw a conclusion to.
Okay. And then my next question would be, do you view, I supposed earlier in one of my arguments that you would view God as the foundation of good, not as separate from good, as Euthyphro would put. Is that the case?
God's nature, the goodness reflects God's nature. So God is good by the very definition of who he is.
Can God do anything outside of his nature?
No.
Okay, so he is bound by his nature.
That's just saying he just does what he does. Yeah.
Well, no, you said he cannot. Not he will not. He cannot.
Right. God can't do something. God can't do something that is out of accord with who he is. So yeah, that's a biblical position. For example, the Bible says that God can't lie. It would be logically impossible for a perfectly holy and good God to do that which is not perfect and holy. So I would say that he acts consistently with who he is. To act outside of his nature would be a contradiction in terms.
Okay.
And as I'm sure you would understand, you probably heard some Christian apologists say this, and I'm in agreement, that God doesn't do the logically impossible. And I wouldn't say that that's a detriment to his omnipotence, because the logically impossible is not a thing. It's just a conglomeration.
I agree with you on this. I actually have a video on my channel called The Worst Arguments Against God, and the first one I bring up is the argument from the stone, basically saying, please stop using this argument. It's horrible.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, that would be my response. God does anything consistent with his nature, and he doesn't do anything that's contrary to his nature.
Doesn't do anything contrary to his nature. Okay. And you would agree that he is omnipotent and all-loving, correct?
What do you mean by all-loving?
All-loving, as I defined earlier, that he has unconditional love for his creation. He has agape love.
I would say that God loves his creation, but there are different degrees within his love. He doesn't love everyone in precisely the same way.
Okay. Is there a verse that you can reference to where he says that?
Yes, as a deduction from Scripture. For example, we have the idea of the hatred of God. In Psalm 5, it says, I hate the worker of iniquity. But then in another sense, there's a sense in which God does love the world, but that sense is qualified by those other statements which we tried in Scripture that we try to hold consistently. So there's a way in which God hates.
So it's not unconditional love.
Well, I mean,
because there are conditions that you've just set up.
I'm sorry.
Because there are conditions and qualifiers.
I haven't set up any conditions.
In,
the Bible teaches
in conversation. In conversation, you have set them up. Not that they were set up by you in particular, but within the conversation.
Right. I would say that in the scriptures themselves, God himself differentiates his love. You have explicit scriptures which talk about his specific and special love for his covenant people. You have scriptures that talk about his general love for mankind, but it's not a kind of redemptive love. We talk about in theology this idea of common grace. That is an expression of a kind of love, but it's definitely not the same kind of love that God has for his elect. So there is differentiation within the Bible itself. And so since the Bible is my standard, the basis upon which I formulate these ideas, that's consistent within my perspective. If anyone tries to define omnibenevolence in some way that's contrary to that, I would just say that such a conception would be contrary to my worldview and wouldn't apply to me.
Okay. Then my next question would be, what is your view on hell?
Eternal conscious torment. Eternal
conscious torment.
Right. But I understand that Christians within the realm of orthodoxy hold to a wide range of views on that. This happens to be my view. So my view, I'm convinced that this is the correct way. But I have conversations with people about different perspectives.
That's why I didn't declare what your version of hell was when I was speaking earlier. I recognize there's several versions of hell that have been posited, and a lot of them end up stemming from, for instance, the Apocalypse of Peter, which was then extrapolated into Dante's Inferno, and that gave us our very like Southern Baptist-y version of hell. Whereas the Bible itself is somewhat vague in many of its passages when dealing with hell.
All right, that's time. All right, Eli, you have 10 minutes, your final 10 minutes to cross-examine Chris.
Okay. Let me see here. Okay, we talked about love. You have a philosophical perspective, agnosticism, so that's consistent with your pragmatism because you admitted that we can't know objective reality. Let me see where I would go from here. I mean, it's very difficult to say. I guess I could ask, I'm still convinced that your position of pragmatism within your worldview perspective, if it's true, would you agree that within your worldview you don't have the preconditions to know objective reality, and so your view is skeptical about everything? We really can't know anything in its reality, just perception.
So it sounds, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the argument from the ass.
I'm not familiar with the argument from the ass.
This is actually an old Greek argument. I'm not.
I believe you. I believe you.
So the argument from the ass states, this is important for this. The argument from the ass is an argument against skepticism. The ass as a donkey is stuck between two piles of feed, and the piles of feed are equidistant. They are equal sized. So the donkey is skeptical on which one it should eat. The donkey basically cannot pull an ought from the is of the current situation, which is a giant problem that everybody has issues with. You can't pull an ought from an is in any situation. Because the donkey cannot figure out which pile it should eat from, the donkey starves due to its skepticism and its inability to know which side it needs to go. The donkey ends up dying. So with pragmatism, there's a conversation where skepticism is concerned. So you do have a level of skepticism towards essentially everything. If somebody tells me one thing that they believe or one thing they think is true, I will probably look it up without taking their word on it, which pisses a lot of my friends off. That's unfortunate for them. I'm sorry. But in that skepticism, pragmatism also holds that there is no utility in not taking a position. This is why I didn't begin this by taking a non-position, something that, again, thank you for having a modicum of respect for. Pragmatism would hold that there's no utility in taking that non-position or not actually acting. So pragmatically, the donkey would have to choose, regardless of there being a good or worse option, would have to choose one of the two sides. So yes, in that skepticism, we can't know something ontologically, but in pragmatism, we must still act, because without action, there is no utility.
Okay, but the story of the ass presupposes the objective reality that the ass exists. So if we can't know anything about objective reality, then my next question would be, do you know that you exist?
Can you operate under beliefs alone?
I'm sorry?
Can you operate
under
under
question? So I'm just asking the question. Given your perspective, if we can't know objective reality, then can someone know objectively that they exist? If you can know objectively that you exist, then you can know some aspect of objective reality, which would refute the idea that we can't know objective reality. So you see what I'm saying?
Knowing an aspect about objective reality does not mean that you know objective reality. You've been able to pull an aspect of it from your perception, which has marginal utility. It may be closer in proximity to the ontological truth of the matter, but it does not necessitate that you have actually gotten close enough to perceive the ontological truth of the matter. My position is that one can operate entirely on belief alone. Those beliefs can lead them to knowledge, possibly. Whether they know that they actually have knowledge, as much of a tautology as that statement is a bit hard to perceive, but a being just in general can operate purely on belief, especially if they have to make action.
But you did say just then that we could move closer to the ontology. But how would you know we would be moving closer to the ontology since we can't know, on your view,
you have no way of knowing, but it doesn't matter.
I'm sorry?
You have no way of knowing, but it doesn't matter. For instance, if I am closer to what the ontological value of graphite is, what it actually is in general, that neither helps nor hinders, and in many cases it may hinder because it will throw me into the problem of the ass of unfettered skepticism, essentially. I have no way of knowing the ontological value of every single facet of the chemical makeup of this graphite, but I recognize that this graphite has utility. It can be used to write. It can be used for several other experiments that can be used in other instances. So you don't keep going and hit that infinite regress. You go until you get to the point where, okay, this has now become absurd. If you get to the point where it feels like it's becoming absurd, then there's no reason to continue forward at that point. This is why pragmatism is commonly used as an answer to solipsism.
Right, and I don't think it's a good argument, because my point is that pragmatism does reduce to absurdity, since on the one hand you're positing pragmatism, but then you make claims that look like knowledge claims, but then you have to admit that's not knowledge. Your worldview seems to not be able to provide the preconditions for knowledge. I mean, even by saying, well, we could only just know perception, that's a knowledge claim. And you say, well, I don't know if that's objectively true. Well, that's a knowledge claim. I don't see how you could avoid the infinite regress. If infinite regression is absurdity, then I would say that that's what seems that your worldview goes down that route. That's why I'm I'm trying my best to understand what you're saying, but it seems as though you're proving my point in my initial argument, that to reject a worldview that has the foundation that I'm suggesting, the position is reduced to absurdity. If your position is pragmatism, you got the infinite regress. If your position is empiricism, you got problems there. If your position is rationalism, there's problems there. So I tried to, I put those out as red meat just to, and I'm glad you clarified, you didn't take any of those. You said, well, I'm a pragmatist, and that helps narrow things down. But it seems that position, really, you can't make any certain claims about anything, even that pragmatism is something useful, because that's an objective knowledge claim. How would you respond to that?
My response to that would be, we would have to look at what the fruits of that particular epistemology are. So under pragmatism, under pragmatic thought, we have, as an example, I hate the word scientism, and I hate people who adhere to science being the end all be all to everything. I can't stand that. Science doesn't get you to ethics, as an example. There's a reason we have a separate category for ethics of science. But under pragmatism, we can see things like philosophy of science, instrumentalism, and we can see these things and we can determine their utility. So how do we determine the utility of, say, alchemy versus science? Well, we look at its fruits. Well, how do we determine the utility of pragmatism versus, say, solipsism? Well, we look at its fruits. If solipsism naturally would beget somebody who operates as if they are the only living being on the planet and everything else is a manifestation of their mind, in hard solipsism, the type of person that is begot from that largely doesn't have any utility behind anything they do. They don't have a reason to do anything for anybody else except, say, feed themselves, because they're the only one they can even figure that exists. But even then, the food that they're consuming might not exist. Under pragmatism, though, you still have to actually go into action. So the fruits of pragmatism end up outweighing the fruits of something like solipsism.
Right, but the fruit is not something that is known objectively. It's a perception of what that fruit is. And so we can have
Sure.
skepticism literally about everything that we perceive to be the fruit and utility of something. You're again,
Yeah.
Right. And so that position would destroy the possibility of knowing anything at all.
And there's nothing wrong with that. A being can operate entirely on beliefs.
Do you know that to be true?
I believe it to be true, and I can operate on that.
Right, but you see the infinite regress. I could ask you, do you know that you believe that to be true? It's going to keep going back because that's the nature.
Can you
of
explain
the
what the problem of an infinite regress is?
I'm sorry?
Can you explain what the actual issue of an infinite regress is?
Right. If I were to say, why do you believe, A? And you say, well, because of this. And I was like, why do you believe that? Because of this. Why do you believe that? Because of this. And you continue to go ad infinitum, then you have never justified how you actually know the initial thing. Infinite regression will destroy the possibility of understanding anything because you could never have a justification, a stopping point that actually grounds that. You'd go on forever and never know anything, which if that's true, that position is reduced to absurdity, since you'd have to say on that view, okay, we can't know anything. But if you can't know anything, how do we know we can't know anything? That position is self-refuting. And so I would see that position as an absurd position, unless you have some kind of stopping point that can ground those beliefs and give a proper justification for them. I think the Christian worldview can do that.
See, I don't necessarily see there's being an issue with not having.
All right, that's time right there for Eli's 10 minutes, final 10 minutes. All right, Chris, you now can question Eli for your final 10 minutes.
Sure. So for my final 10 minutes, I want to get into the concept of hell for a little bit. So you brought up that your version of hell is eternal conscious torture. So this is something that a being would be able to perceive till the end of time. And what is your definition of torture that you're using for this?
I don't know. The description of hell is where the difficulty comes for me. I know people have different ideas of what hell actually entails. To be quite honest, based on my own study, I'm not sure in what way the people suffer. I know one aspect of the suffering is being eternally separated from God. And so, that is going to be a part of it. But in regards to the details, I'm not so sure. And that's a conversation that I'd like to have with my fellow Christians to kind of explore that a little more.
Okay, but you do view it as suffering of a nature, correct?
Oh, yes, very much so.
Okay. All right, then it doesn't actually matter. I would argue that it doesn't matter then what type of suffering it is, because regardless of if the suffering is burning forever or being tickled forever or having a graphite pencil slowly pushed into your ear but never quite penetrating all the way through forever, these are all forms of suffering, unless somebody's got a weird kink that I'm not entirely certain of and would maybe question. So my position would be that it doesn't matter what type of torture it is or what type of suffering. All suffering is equal if it's infinite, because there's not going to be any difference between one type of suffering or another if they're infinite. Just like all type of happiness.
I would disagree with that.
You would disagree.
I would disagree with that. So, for example,
you can see a functional difference between suffering if it's infinite.
Well, I would argue that there may be some indication within the Bible that discusses different degrees of punishment, so that people in hell are all punished, but there are different degrees. Now, what does that look like? I don't know. Only God knows the degree and the degree that's appropriate for the person. But I don't see that that's necessarily the case, that it's just all the same.
So the reason I say that it's all the same, from a finite amount of time, we perceive any type of suffering that we have based on the degree of suffering that we have and the length of time we have in that type of suffering, which will increase the degree of suffering. For instance, if you're familiar, I'm not sure how familiar you are with like old school military torture methods, but many of them. I have
gandered in the Encyclopedia of Torture. I don't know. There's actually an encyclopedia that goes into different torture methods throughout history. So I have dabbled a little bit out of curiosity, but go ahead.
Okay. So what we find when we look at torture methods that have been used throughout history, many torture methods, and some of the most psychologically damaging ones, are ones that we would consider mundane if they were done for a short period of time. For instance, dripping water on somebody's forehead for an amount of time while they're strapped down. This is considered a relatively mundane thing to endure for even 10 minutes. However, when we extend this torture to a long amount of time, for instance, an hour, a day, a handful of days, we find that the torture actually gets magnified greatly to the point where it is equivalent to, if not worse than, other types of more violent, brutal torture. So my position is that if someone is suffering, if that suffering is infinite, all suffering eventually will reach a point where it is indistinguishable in the amount of tautology as it is. I would say torture, actually, you used conscious torture, this is fine. Any type of torture of any kind will result in the same amount of suffering if the amount of time allowed is infinite, because there is no end point. They will all reach the same point and continue on past that point infinitely.
Well, I mean, you're saying all these things. I'm not committed to those understandings from my worldview. And if you're saying that from your worldview, you're not even sure that that's objectively true, since within your worldview, you can't know that. You perceive that that's how things work and how these things would have various logical entailments. I'm not obligated within my worldview to understand the things the way you've just described them.
Okay, and that's fine that you're not obligated to. So then my next question would be, do you view God as all good? Any action that he takes would be good?
Yes.
Okay, and so you view him, do you view that there are people who are predestined to go to hell? They are born and they will be going to hell, period. They are simply not elect, they are reprobate.
Yes.
Okay, and do you view that as just, that these people were born never having a chance to actually be saved?
Well, we're going to have to get into some theological weeds there, which is fine. If we were, discussing theology as an entire conversation, I wouldn't want to imagine to get into the details of that here. However,
well, it was a yes/no question.
I'm sorry.
Well, it was a yes/no question. Do you view it as just?
Well, it's yes or no questions can be pretty tricky because I'd want to qualify certain things. But if you're asking within my worldview, and you're asking is something fair, even if I didn't know how it would be fair, if I were to say it's fair, which I think it is, since God always does good, it is a good thing. Even if I wouldn't be able to explain to you the details of all that, my worldview does not require me to go into the details and explain it. My worldview provides, my worldview within it is that everything that God does is good. Now, if I can't explain, well, how is this good? That's irrelevant to me having or God having a sufficient reason, a good reason for why he's doing those things. So there's no inconsistency within my own perspective. If
so, I wanted to catch you on a thing that you did
people
there.
To hell, it's a good thing and it's just because God did it. God doesn't do anything not just, and so it would logically follow that it is just. Now, if you were to respond with a question, but what about? Those are interesting in-house theological issues, but given the truth of my worldview, it would be just. And so there wouldn't be a logical problem there.
Okay, so there's two questions I want to ask on that.
Okay.
The first one is, do you recognize that you accidentally equivocated there?
Maybe, but I'd be happy. I mean, I'm not perfect. I would love for you to clarify.
So I used the word just, and you swapped to the word fair. Are you? I'm fairly certain that you're using these interchangeably.
I did. To answer your question, I did recognize that I equivocated. So yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you recognize that just refers to an action that's justified under its particular circumstances. It can also be defined as a suspension of mercy. Fair refers to an action that treats people as they deserve to be treated. Many times actions are just, but they are simply not fair. Many times actions are fair, but there is no justice in their fairness.
Mm-hmm.
So swapping these words put you in a weird place.
Thank you. I did equivocate. So kind of just responding and thinking off the top of my head. I would say that everything God does in regards to exercising his justice, he is right in doing so. And it is truly the just thing to do, whatever he does.
Okay. So then we recognize that under that worldview, should he elect, I know you're a father, should he elect to take one of your children and say that they are not elect, they are doomed to suffer for eternity, and there's nothing that you or anyone else can do about it, no matter how hard they try, do you see that as a just action?
Well, I would say that God is free to elect anyone he pleases. And so what I think is irrelevant to whether that's just or not. Now, we do make a distinction within Reformed theology between God's decrees and secondary causes and things like that. And so we do not believe within our worldview that our actions don't matter. Now, we could get into the intricacies of those things, and then we'll just be opening up theological issues, which is fine. But given my worldview, God is free to predestine anyone, and he is free to send everyone to hell if he wants, and he's free to send everyone to heaven, and he has the freedom to do that. It's irrelevant what I think. God can predestine my children from before the foundation of the world to go to hell if he sees fit.
Okay. And you are perfectly fine worshiping this God that would condemn your children to eternal punishment and not give them a choice in the matter.
Within my worldview, I don't understand the things in the simplistic way that we just kind of did that exchange. Within my worldview, I agree that God is just. He has morally sufficient reasons for what he allows and what he does, what he permits, what he causes. And I would say that in order for me to say that that's wrong, I'd have to presuppose something inconsistent with my worldview, namely an external standard of good that I perceive God not to be acting in accord with. Now, I do believe that when God saved me, the Bible teaches that my actions do matter in some way. And so I do bring my children up in the admonition of the Lord. And the Bible says that God ordains not only the ends, but the means. And so I see my actions as very important. So it's not this issue of, well, God, could have predestined my children to hell. So how could you worship a God like that? Well, it's more complex than that. If you read some of the Christian creeds, we go into some of the details of the relationship between God's sovereign decrees and human actions and their importance.
All right. That is the end of the cross-examination portion of this debate.